The big question is, does President Biden even have the authority to issue a vaccine mandate? As far as Bob Destro is concerned, that's the question Americans should be asking. Quote, "This is all about the consent of the governed," he argues. And there's no one more qualified to explain why than this professor at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law. A member of the faculty for almost 40 years, Professor Destro has served as a commissioner on the United States Commission of Civil Rights and as a special counsel to the Ohio Attorney General and the Ohio Secretary of State on election law matters. I'd say he knows what he's talking about where the Constitution is concerned. Professor Destro, welcome to Pray Vote Stand.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Tony. It's great to be here, and those are really important questions that you just raised. It is about the consent of the governed, and if we go back to our founder James Madison, who argued in the context of the first of what was later to become the First Amendment, when he was complaining about Virginia experimenting with taxing for religious purposes. He talked about it being important to take offense right at the very first time that the government tries to do something it's not empowered to do. And that's the question here. I mean, the president doesn't have any authority to issue an executive order if there's no statute to execute. And the same thing is true for a governor or a mayor. They are executives. They're not legislators. They don't have the authority to rule by decree. And that's precisely what we're seeing in these vaccine mandates.
So, Bob, we're coming down to the wire. Many employees are being forced to make a choice because there's a ramp up time to get this vaccine and be fully vaccinated by the deadline. So many are making choices, even as we speak here tonight. We talked about the religious exemption. That's one element, but it's not the only means of resisting this government overreach. So I want to start with a couple of questions. First is, I know ultimately in our system of government, it is the courts that become the final arbiter of, disagreements or, I don't necessarily like it that way, but, sometimes it's the courts. That's why the courts are so important. But on its face, the average citizen can determine whether or not something appears to be beyond the bounds of the Constitution and the legitimate authority of government, therefore raising these questions and being willing, if need be, go to court and challenge them. So talk a little bit about that aspect of this, how the average citizen should be, that's faced with this choice, how they can view it if religious issues are not the driving issue for them, if it's something else, how do they go about defending that?
Well, you're right. Individuals need to complain. They need to complain early. They need to complain often. It may well be that you need to sue your employer. Remember, the government here is now compelling employers to force people to be vaccinated. And that's a problem all by itself. You have the first question of authority is, where does President Biden or anybody else get the authority to force us to take a shot? The second is, where do they get the authority to force an employer to either force somebody to be vaccinated or to fire them? So it seems to me that the federal government is forcing employers out on a limb, and when and if something goes wrong, those employers are going to be held accountable. If somebody's injured, they're not going to be exempt in the same way that Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson are going to be. Those are all to be worked out, and those are only the beginning of the problems that we have here constitution-wise.
So the federal government, through their mandate, is actually putting private employers on the hook if as employees began to take suits against them, especially if you have some, I would think, side effects from some of these forced vaccinations. When you look at the process, so what would be the process for someone to file a suit? They have to go out and hire an attorney? Should they, we've got some of these suits already working their way through the process. Do you think that we might see some court resolution on this before the full deadlines take place in January?
Well, the wheels of justice grind very slowly. So I'm not sure we're going to see a resolution. Hopefully, we'll have some injunctions, some orders from the courts not to proceed. But the way this administration has done business, they haven't shown much respect for the courts. They've actually gone after them in a big way. And so I do think that it's going to be a while. And remember, it's the mandate's only the beginning. If you look at what's going on in places like China and Europe, it's this question of what does it mean to be fully vaccinated? That's going to be a moving target. Right now, you have to have two vaccinations. How many boosters are you going to need? I mean, those are the kinds of some of the questions. We are now talking about smaller employees, smaller employers and children. I think a lot of parents will draw the line in the sand with children. I see that in a recent report from China, even Chinese parents are objecting to having their children vaccinated. And when you go on and you look at some of the downstream issues like vaccine passports, travel restrictions, social credit scoring, I mean, this is a can of worms that didn't need to be opened, and now we're in the middle of it.
So what we do here as individuals, collectively as a society, the choices we make now will really set the course for the future.
Absolutely. I mean, if you don't control the area under your skin, you control nothing. The same principle that allows them to stick a needle in you for their own public health purposes will also allow the Chinese to compel an abortion. It's exactly the same principle.
It appears that the administration may already be on the defensive. They're now saying this is not a mandate. I want to play a clip from the Deputy Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, when she was asked about this mandate.
As for the legal side of this, let me be crystal clear to avoid what appears to be possible misinformation or disinformation around the emergency temporary standard being a vaccine mandate. That would be on its face incorrect, as has been explicit for months. It is a standard for safe workplace to either comply with weekly testing or to be vaccinated.
So, Bob, are you putting out misinformation? This is actually not a mandate. You have a choice as to whether or not to comply.
The idea that I'm happy she used the term misinformation because at the same time as she's accusing those of us who are talking about this about misinformation, the federal government's pressuring Google and Facebook and all the other social media companies to shut down discussions of the vaccine, and because they want to protect us from misinformation. The fact of the matter is that the proof is in the pudding. It's the employers hear it as a mandate, they see it as a mandate, and that's what it is.
One final question for you, Bob Destro. She made reference to this, but the emergency procedures here. The Department of Labor through OSHA has short-circuited. They have done an in-run around the normal rulemaking process, which takes years. How do they justify the emergency when the numbers of cases are declining? We now have this new drugs out, the antiviral drugs that could actually treat COVID. We have all these things happening, much different situation than we were a year ago. How do they justify that this is an emergency where they can short circuit the rules?
I don't think they have any intention of justifying. I mean, as far as they're concerned, an emergency suspends the Constitution, and it also suspends due process. There's a process set out in the statute, just as Ryan pointed out a little while ago about the process that employers are supposed to go through with respect to religious exemptions. There's also accommodation requests under the Americans with Disabilities Act. A friend of mine was just told that he's going to have to sit in front of a group of lawyers who are going to decide whether his religious or his medical exemption request from a doctor from a major medical center is good enough, for their for a medical exemption. I mean, the fact that the letter says he might die if he takes the shot apparently is not good enough for the lawyers.
Wow, a lot at stake in this debate. Bob Destro, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Always great to talk with you.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me.